Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Kona Shen. Kona is the Vice President and General Manager of My90 and Community Request at Axon. She co-founded My90 in 2016 to help the public and police communicate using accessible, data-driven technology. Kona joined Axon in 2021 following the acquisition of My90. Prior to co-founding My90, Kona founded GOALS Haiti, an award-winning nonprofit organization that uses sport as a tool to spark long-term community development. She holds a BA in Development Studies from Brown and a master's in International Policy from Stanford University. This was they're all fun conversations, let's be honest. That's why I do this. But this was a fun conversation. Kona is fantastic and doing some really interesting work at the intersection between police departments and their communities. And as anyone in America who's listening to this right now knows, there is some tension there. And she has created this company to go out and survey communities who have interactions with the police department to really understand not just were you satisfied, but what was that experience like and how can police departments use a person's lived experience to make the next engagement with a community member a better one. There's a ton in here that people can take to help themselves have hard conversations with their constituents, whether it's your team members, your employees, whether it's your customers, whether it's anybody in any organization that you're trying to deal with. There are lessons that you can tease out of here that absolutely 100% apply. If you're interested in any of the topics we talk about today, you can reach out to me, as always, on LinkedIn with a direct message. Happy to keep the conversation going. Kona at the end provides her contact information, and it's also listed in the show notes as well. Love to engage with folks out there who want to engage in these topics. That is why we do this. Here is Kona Shen. Kona, welcome to the show. Excited to have you on. As listeners have maybe heard me say before, I think it's really interesting when you can take people or situations that are a little bit on the outside of the norm or the extreme end of the norm and examine them for the lessons you can learn, because I think the examples are much more prominent, but I think they distill back into principles that everybody can apply. And so really interested in the conversation today and diving into My90 and what you did and why you did it and how it's all working. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's start a little bit at the beginning, even before My90, like to set the table a little bit here. You mentioned in our prep call together the concept of social entrepreneurship and that you had been drawn to that early on. What is social entrepreneurship and what attracted you to that concept?
The idea behind social entrepreneurship is that you can optimize social benefit in addition to maximizing financial returns. And a lot of the time we think about social entrepreneurship within the framework of the triple bottom line. So that's where it's social, environmental, and financial are all of the things that you're looking at the same time. I got interested in social entrepreneurship at first because I started working with a program that was focused on homelessness in King County, where Seattle's located. And it became very personal because it was, how do you help somebody who's sleeping outside on the street? How do you help somebody who's hungry? And the program I volunteered for went out of business because they ran out of money. So I think from an early age, I was really interested in helping people and thinking about inequality, but acutely aware that if you don't have the model set up right, it doesn't matter much. If you're not going to be there long term, you're only going to get so much done.
Yeah. I interviewed a gentleman named Neem Gandhi on the show, and he was the chief population health officer at a large health system, became the chief financial officer. And it was interesting. We talked about him switching hats and having to take more of a financial view. The mantra that he talked about was no margin, no mission. If you can't sustain the mission goes away. And so profit, well, even in a nonprofit, the finances, the being able to sustain yourself over long term and be able to deal with negative forces that may come up out of nowhere, like that, it's critical. Mm-hmm. In your learning of social entrepreneurship, how do you think about incentives? Because I think that's always like, well, profit corrupts the incentives, right? Everybody's greedy. We all want money. Like that's going to take away from whatever the mission is. How have you seen, or what have you learned about being able to align incentives with the mission?
Do you mean incentives for the leaders or incentives for the people who are benefiting?
I mean, money for the people running the organization. Because if it becomes a for-profit, right? Social entrepreneurship being for-profit ventures that help the world or humanity in some way. Just always curious about human incentives and how we make sure that people can make money and thrive that way at the company level, but that the mission doesn't get abused or neglected in some way.
It's a great question. And one of my favorite examples of a prominent nonprofit that people don't often think of is the NFL. The NFL is a nonprofit organization, and they are pretty good at incentives and performance and making money. And I think that that says a lot about how we conceptualize what a nonprofit is versus what a for-profit company is. So if you're thinking about incentives, you can have compensation for the leaders, you can have milestones, you can have key deliverables. And I think that something that gets a little bit trickier is if you have the triple bottom line and you're thinking about social, environmental, and financial as a classic template, if push comes to shove, how are you going to make a decision? How are you really going to walk the walk and not just say that we're a B Corp, for example, a benefit corporation, and actually make sure that that's part of your decision making? And there are some pretty well-known B Corps at this point, like Athleta, Ben & Jerry's, Honest Company. And they have to work really closely with a balanced board to make sure that they are driving financial growth and returns in addition to staying true to their mission when they have these big decisions about how to scale. And I'm not involved with any of those companies, but I think that having a well-balanced, high-performing board is actually the answer for-profit and nonprofit organizations.
Yeah. So we're going to get off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I like this conversation. So what are best practices in setting up that type of board or those types of advisors? Because I'm of the belief that our ability to self-police is a critical component to our ability to be successful as a group. And you just see that, you see groups get big, you see them get really scared of losing market share or losing whatever they have, and they'll sweep something bad will happen. They'll sweep it under the rug. Maybe they're fine for a while, but then inevitably it explodes later with way worse repercussions. So what have you seen as far as good practices in building those kinds of checks and balances within an organization?
Well, that's a tough question. This is something that I'm trying to learn a lot more about all the time. And I think that the mission is the first thing to really nail down. So I'm now at a large company called Axon, which is one of the world's biggest public safety technology companies. Axon has a moonshot mission to cut gun-related deaths between the public and the police by 50% in 10 years. And when you have something with that clarity that's measurable and time-bound, every decision you make during the day can in some way ladder up to that goal. And sometimes it's more indirect. Sometimes it's really a straight shot. But the idea here is that if you know what the overarching mission is, you can make the best ethical and impactful decisions along the way. And if you're struggling with that, because these are big, lofty goals that we're setting, which is the most exciting kind, that again is where I think you come back to the idea that you surround yourself with people who balance your weaknesses and can have an honest discussion about what you think you can do well and what you can't. I would say the more experience I get, the more willing I am to lead with what I'm not good at and be acutely aware of where my weaknesses are so that as a group, we're high performing. And I think that when I was starting out, that was a little bit harder because one, you're all weakness, but you're also a lot more bluff and insecurity perhaps about seeming more experienced than you are. And so I think there's something about being at this stage where you can be a little bit more humble and have a little bit more humility so that the end result is actually a lot more impactful.
Yeah. So how would you do it differently than going back to your younger leader self? I don't like the, what would you tell your younger self? But let's say you got to start over again. How would you lead with more humility and weakness if you were starting over?
My first job out of college was in 2010, and I had been focused on international development in Haiti, and there was a large earthquake there in January 2010. And I went from being able to just volunteer to being able to work there full time. So I graduate from college. 3 weeks later, I'm living in rural Haiti in a tent and starting a nonprofit from the ground up in an area that I had worked in for years before then, but was really hard hit by this earthquake. Through a generous donation from someone from my university, I was able to hire people, create jobs, deliver aid, and create programs right off the bat. I was right out of college and I was managing 4 people on pretty much day one who were local leaders from the area. And I would say what we had going for us is that we already knew each other, I already spoke the language, and we already had some trust between us. And I would say what we didn't have going for us is that I was all impatience. I was demanding and expected them to do things a certain way, even though we're coming from very different contexts. Everything from how do you make a to-do list to how do you rush somebody. I think I learned mostly that when you can entice somebody to go in the right direction versus shove them that direction, you're going to get a lot more done and enjoy a lot more, have a lot less stress involved. The main thing I would change looking back is just being able to take a beat, be a little bit more patient, and focus a little bit more on having a conversation about why things aren't going well and building the trust and having the relationship instead of just kind of getting all frenzied about, hey, why are we not on track?
Command and control.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's funny. I was not in Haiti doing this work, but when I started at my current organization, I'm building a book of business. My income is 100% commission, so there's a lot at risk. And when I finally started to land a few clients, it was like, oh my God, we got to keep these clients. And I was a little command and control, probably a lot of command and control in how that work got done, and got that feedback, same kind of thing. And I've just found, like, if you can just focus on being more collaborative with everybody, it allows for more organic ideas, better ideas, allows for better context. And then a lot of those issues that you were just talking about go away. So yeah, I've dealt with that myself.
I also think when you're an entrepreneur, and I think of everyone in sales as an entrepreneur, because I had a short stint as a government sales account executive. And one of the main things that I learned in that job was if you take your foot off the gas for one day, you'll feel it, even if it's 6 months later. You might have a slow day with your pipeline eventually. And so what I learned in that role was it doesn't always matter what you do that day, but it matters a lot that you're making slow and steady progress and being consistent. And the baby steps count. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons that the relationships go so far, because if someone's all over you and stressing you out, you don't always want to start even with the baby steps. So making it easy to get the ball rolling seems to go a long way.
Yeah. Because the most powerful force in the universe is compounding, right? And relationships compound as much as anything. So starting it slow, building it a little bit slower than you want, eventually you find that you've made a lot of progress over a fairly short period of time.
Completely agree.
Yeah. It's the same. I was just looking at this workout competition to do, and I was thinking about, it was kind of a longer workout, and I was thinking about how to do it. It's this thing called a High Rocks competition, if anyone wants to look it up. They're doing one in Chicago this year, so I was looking it up. And I was thinking about that, and it was like, I think the fastest way to get through this is, there are like 16 components to it, is just to find the pace that you can get through everything at about the same consistency. And it's just like, what's the fastest pace you can work consistently? And I think that applies to that fitness challenge, but it applies to so many other things too. It's like, so much of what we do is a marathon. It is a long-term play. And like, what's just the fastest pace that you can sustain so that you don't burn yourself out? And that pace, you can get a little progressively faster over time, but that pace will allow you to get way out ahead of where you thought you could be otherwise.
Have you heard the term cockroach mentality?
No, I have not. That's a new one.
So it's pithy, but not so flattering. So it's the same idea. It's the idea of just don't give up. Sometimes the people who will succeed the most are the people who are left standing at the end of this.
Yeah.
That's some of the best advice I got when we started My 90. It was from our very first angel investor in Silicon Valley. I think that he might have gotten this from Y Combinator, and this was one of Paul Graham's founding principles. It was just this idea of you just got to survive in this space. And that includes you don't run out of money, you don't burn out, you just keep going. And at the end of the day, the person that survives the longest a lot of times wins the most, even if it seems like the tortoise and the hare for the whole race.
Yep. That's totally true. We talk about the infinite game, Simon Sinek's book. We talk about that a lot at work. I mean, the Navy SEALs have been examined to death over the last decade, but that whole thing, the whole BUDS training is just don't quit. It's just who sticks around at the end. It's not about who's like the most elite at the beginning. It's just about who can make it through that and endure that. So yeah, those lessons apply all over the place. All right, let's jump into what we're here to talk about. We went down a few rabbit holes there, which I always love, but let's bring it back to My 90. So what is My 90 and how did you get this idea with this social entrepreneurship bent?
My 90 is an engagement tool that bridges the gaps between law enforcement leaders, their officers, and the communities they serve. And what that means is that we create optional opportunities for people to give feedback, usually after contact with the police. And these are web-based surveys after people call 911 for help, if they walk into a police department at the front desk, if they're a victim of a crime, they go to a community event. And we also have traffic stops and even some small pilots around people who are arrested. So a wide spectrum there of people that we're seeking to get feedback from. We also have quarterly employee surveys. And what these have in common is that, one, they're confidential. And so the question is, how do you get real feedback from people? Not just the angriest people or the most happy people, but a little bit more of that normal bell curve and get more of the middle of the pack to contextualize what you're seeing and what you're hearing. And then the second thing that they have in common is that the law enforcement leaders get the results from the surveys. They can review them internally or choose to share them publicly. And they use them to figure out what's going well and what needs more attention. And if something's going well, it's an opportunity to recognize an officer who's done something that stood out to a member of the public. Or if something needs more attention, it's as simple as a brief reminder at roll call that welfare checks, for example, should be this amount of time and you go through these steps. Don't rush through it and leave that community member feeling like the wellness check didn't really check up on the person they're concerned about. So it can be very small procedural adjustments, but those small changes lead to a lot of trust if the department continues to follow up. And I would say the two things that I would point out about it are we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. So these are not official complaints or official investigations. If somebody wants to have an official complaint or an official commendation, which is like the fancy form of a compliment, then you can have that still go through the department's existing channels. We're really focused on that day to day. And then the other thing I would point out is that a lot of the time when you start with My 90, departments are worried that they're just going to get bashed. The departments are worried that it's going to be all negative. I'm not sure if people know this, but basically every police department in the United States has a Yelp review or a Google review that they definitely did not create, where people have just gone out of their way to go online, create a page, share unsolicited feedback. And it's a little bit like shouting into the void. It's not something the department is looking for. It's not something they're typically using. And so the idea here is bridge the gap between the people who are having these experiences and the people who can do something about it, but do so in a way that's constructive and points us in the direction of what specific steps would the community like to see. And that rounds out the body cam footage and the dash cam footage and the police reports, which are really important, but they're all from the police's point of view. And so sometimes a community member has a point of view, right or not, that is very different from what that body camera shows. And police chiefs are the first to say that if somebody perceives that there's a problem, that's a problem, which means that if your community thinks you have a racial profiling problem and your numbers don't back that up based on your pretextual traffic stops, you still have a pretty big problem if that's how your community feels. So you need to know it, and you're not necessarily going to see it in your other data.
Yeah. Yeah. You may not have a racial profiling problem, but you have a huge PR problem.
Exactly.
Yeah. How did this come about?
My 90 was really personal when I started working on it. I have a co-founder, Mustafa Abdul Hamid. Mustafa's from St. Louis, and we met at Stanford in grad school in 2014, right after Michael Brown had been killed in Ferguson, Missouri. So Mustafa came to grad school and was fresh out of this experience where someone in not his exact community, but really close to his immediate community had been killed by the police. And the whole country started to think about law enforcement differently. And his family growing up had experienced some of the mistreatment that we found was really systemic after the release of the Ferguson Commission report, which, among other things, found that African-American residents had been stopped more often, arrested more often, even if they were less likely to have some type of illegal materials in their possession. That's a really long way of saying this idea of driving while Black was a real experience. And it was not a surprise to the community that when Michael Brown was killed, events erupted in the way that it did. There was this kind of simmering situation that just erupted. And so Mustafa came right to Stanford after this had happened in August of 2014. I show up at Stanford after living in Haiti for 3 years and getting reintroduced to the United States around this time and thinking about the good and also the not so good. And after living in rural Haiti, I was shocked that we had this obvious problem that nobody seemed to be making progress on. And I was so curious why it was something that we were just accepting was a problem. And it didn't seem like the needle was moving all that much. And I would say that my 90 has gotten more personal over time. So in grad school, Mustafa and I started dating. We got married. We have our own family now.
Oh, wow.
We have these little, so that's the end of that story, or I guess the middle of it. And so we have these little boys running around. And I really hate the thought that anyone, including my friends and my family, could be stopped by the police and treated any differently than, the police chiefs that I've gotten to know. And so it's really personal to think about the 10-year countdown until my oldest son starts driving, help us all. And, how am I really going to make this better? And part of that becomes, how do you not create a solution that's just paying lip service to making things better and making departments look better, but in fact, improving the actual interaction that the officer's having with the person behind the wheel or the person calling for help? So it is very personal, but it really comes down to this idea that you can't improve what you don't measure. And it was a long journey. My 90, we started thinking about it in 2014. The crossroads that I thought that country was at in 2014, thinking and talking about law enforcement, was definitely not actually happening in 2014. And then I thought 2 years later in 2016, which is when Philando Castile was shot in a traffic stop, and also 5 Dallas police officers were killed, was another crossroads. And I thought that's when we were actually going to be moving in a slightly different direction. And as it turns out, it was 2020 when George Floyd was killed. And that was the first time in history that after somebody was killed, before the investigations, before the polished statements, you saw police chiefs all around the country saying, this is wrong. There's no justification. There's no investigation that will change our mind, that this is completely unacceptable. So a lot has changed in law enforcement. It has now become body cam footage, cell phone videos. I would say the public discussion around it has become more and more data driven and really looking at the research and trying to understand what we know versus what we don't know. And that's been a bit of a roller coaster. And as part of that, in 2021, we sold the company to Axon. And that's where I now work full time.
That's an awesome story. So you mentioned at the beginning that there was a lot of fear, or even still can be a lot of fear with new police departments when you bring up this concept, because they're like, oh, no, we're going to get all the complaints. It's just going to be more police bashing, all that kind of stuff. How did you overcome that? You've got this group that is, you can't paint any group with a broad brush, but let's give police officers the benefit of the doubt. The vast majority of them are showing up every day to serve and protect. They're putting themselves in dangerous positions to try to take care of communities. And then you've got, bad things that are happening. You've got communities that are feeling antagonistic against them because they feel like they're being targeted. So you get these two groups that are antagonistic against each other. You're coming in and you're like, hey, we've got this service, we've got this product. How do you get them to go to lean in and say, oh, this could be a solution to our problem, versus hunkering down even more and saying well, no, we're just we've got our thing here. We need to protect ourselves?
I think part of it is asking police chiefs if they want to be the ones leading the change and making the decisions for their department, or if they want to be pulled in that direction by city council or community members or people that they don't think can balance all these conflicting issues as well as they can. And I do think that a lot of the time now, police chiefs are the most progressive people that I talk to. They're fighting more for change, and they can call it like they see it more than I can. I'm a guest in their house. They need to be the ones who are saying this is best practice, this is a standard, and anything short of that is just not enough. So I think going into that dynamic and being aware that they are the law enforcement officers who could put their life on the line if they need to. And I'm somebody who has the luxury of trying to improve that industry, but is not actually in their shoes every day, is the starting point. I did not anticipate spending now 10 years studying and learning about and working in law enforcement in the United States. And I've done ride-alongs. I've spent a lot of time with police chiefs. And I think that the more that you can learn about what they're truly concerned about, the better you can address those concerns. So instead of me discounting them and saying, you just need to get it together, this is where we're going and it needs to happen, it's never that conversation. It's tell me what you're concerned about. Tell me what your dynamic is like with the community. Tell me what your discussions are like with your union or your DA or your city council. How can we help you get a better understanding of what's going on and use data so that you feel empowered by this information? Because that information is out there. Whether or not it's on your desk, on your computer, is a different question. I would say if this is what sentiment is, better for you to be the first to know instead of the last to know. But I do think it starts first with learning about their concerns and the things that they're juggling so that we can help, as opposed to trying to convince them otherwise.
That is a great point, and one that I have been thinking more about when it comes to, I guess, social entrepreneurship, but even just like philanthropy, because there are so many philanthropies out there that have a solution. And hey, we're going to go and we're going to do XYZ for this population. And I've been hearing more and more feedback that those groups, while really well-intended, often miss the mark because they're not listening. They're coming in with a solution. And that came up in particular. I was listening to a podcast interview talking about donating cash to underserved groups because they know what they need to do with it. They know where they want to spend the money. They don't need you to tell them where to spend money. But there's a lot of fear around donating cash. And so all that to say, I think it's really smart on your part, and I think it's worth spending a little time on, that you weren't just coming in with a product to this police force and saying, hey, we can solve your problems. It was, hey, we think these tools can be helpful. Let's learn about what you're doing and try to solve your problems with you, if I can put those words in your mouth.
Yeah, well said. And I think that it probably was informed by my time in the nonprofit space. And one way that I used to think about the work in Haiti was this idea of reverse aid dependency, which is just something that I made up. But it was the anecdote to aid dependency, which is the idea that if you're going to come in and say, provide a school and provide food and all of these things, people won't start to fend for themselves and pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they'll always rely on you. Instead of that idea, I wanted our solutions, our programs, to be dependent on the community powering it through volunteer service and making it happen. And so one example of this is communities would vote on what project was most important to them. And I would just present the options within the parameters where, can we afford this? And is it in keeping with the mission of a grassroots nonprofit organization? But an example of that could be bleachers for the soccer field, a sanitary latrine where you don't have any access to toilet facilities. And people can choose which one they want to do or which one they think is more important than. We're not going to pick for them. And also, they're going to show up to actually make it happen. They're going to be the ones carrying the bricks. They're going to be the ones to build it. We'll provide the money, but you're actually going to have the sweat equity. Same concept as Habitat for Humanity, really. And I think that not wanting to overwhelm the intended beneficiaries with some brilliant idea that you think is just the best thing ever is not that dissimilar to sales. In a sales conversation, you're not usually going to someone and saying, I've got the best thing ever. You got to buy this. And here's why you're going to love it. Right.
Some are doing that. Yeah.
I bet in your conversations, I would bet good money that you're going in with discovery and you're thinking about their pain points and the language that they're using and hearing the exact terms that they use so that when you're describing something to them, you're putting it in those existing terms and it's just melding into their understanding of your solution so that you're not having to convince them, much less have them translate in their head what you're talking about and why it matters. I feel like that applies to sales, nonprofits, social entrepreneurship equally.
Yeah, I totally agree. So you basically created customer service departments for police forces. Is that too simple of a term to say?
I'll say one caveat to that.
Okay.
Which is that customer satisfaction in law enforcement is a tricky concept. So
that's where I'm going with this. Yeah.
Do you want to ask the question?
No. Go.
So when I think about My 90 and customer satisfaction, I would never pitch it to a department that way. If a department has already embraced a customer satisfaction mentality and that's one of their overarching goals, then great. We're already halfway there. They already think that this is important and they're looking for solutions. When we started My 90, that was a radical concept. The idea of getting feedback from the public full stop was very scary to departments. 10 years later, now that we have data showing what that feedback looks like and how departments use it, it is a lot more accepted. But the problem is in law enforcement, obviously the customer is not always right. And so we don't want to ask them questions like, you just got a traffic ticket. Are you satisfied with your experience? That's just not the right question to ask.
Yeah.
We focus entirely on procedural justice. And procedural justice is this idea that you want an interaction to be procedurally just or fair, and officers follow the correct protocol, but there's no right outcome that you're asking the community member to judge. And so this is something like, did you have a chance to ask questions? Did you understand what was happening? Did you feel like you were treated with respect? And we try to keep it short. So it should only take 1 or 2 minutes max, but we do include a free field text box where people can say whatever they want. And they do say whatever they want.
I'm sure.
So we get a lot of detail there that is really rich information that we're not requiring from people or forcing out of them where there's a privacy concern. But if they're volunteering all of this information, here's how I felt, here's what the officer did that I liked, here's where I was confused, we can take all that back to the department and help them tease out what's a pattern and where we should take action and where there's just noise.
That's really insightful. And I feel like a lot of customer service protocols still are focused more on, are you satisfied with your experience versus picking out the elements that make a good experience and saying, did you have the opportunity to do X, Y, Z? Did the person offer you this? I think that's way more insightful to what the actual experience was than just the person saying, well, I'm satisfied or not, because they could have come in a bad mood anyway. You could deliver them everything that they asked for and they're still not happy about it. So yeah, I think that's really, really insightful.
And police departments, a lot of the time, can't actually address the problem that people are calling about. People will call 911 because they don't know who else to call, but it doesn't mean that the police department is actually the one that can help. And so when we think about the survey results, that is important to tease out, because if somebody wants a speed bump in front of their house and they're really upset that the dispatcher and the call center couldn't help them with that, we need to understand that versus someone who had an officer at their door or helping them on one of their worst days of their lives, much less ticketing or arresting them. So these are comparing apples to oranges. And it's really important that we're keeping each of these in their individual buckets. And that level of complexity is probably the difference between departments running their own surveys versus going to a specialist for a solution.
Yeah. Any other best practices that you've learned from this survey work around how to draw out actionable insights?
I think that the first step is to make sure that you're creating a neutral survey in the first place. Because I think we've probably all seen those election year surveys that go out, which are, do you like or really, really like this candidate? And those are the only two options. Yeah. So starting with a neutral survey is the foundation. Two, asking people if they had an experience where they were treated fairly or if they were treated respectfully and all of those things. You can also have follow-up questions that stem from that, such as what can the department do better? Or what else would you like to share about that feedback, where people have their minds already primed for thinking about it in this direction where there are bumpers, just like with bowling with kids.
Yeah.
So instead of going in and saying, tell us about your whole experience and what you think, starting with multiple choice that tees them up what kind of survey this is and what we're asking does seem to lead to more focused, free-form feedback. And I think that there's something about keeping it short and sweet, but being very clear about what the scope of the survey is. People understand that. And like you said, you don't want to generalize too much because these are going to anybody who calls 911 in some instances. And at the same time, when you look at it at an aggregate level, the feedback skews positive, it skews constructive, and it's pretty well distributed across demographics like age groups and things like that. So the more survey responses that we get, the easier it is to generalize a little bit that the surveys are doing something useful and capturing a wide swath of people instead of being isolated to people who feel very strongly about one thing or come in, just like piping hot and have a lot to get off their chest.
Yeah. What types of police interactions are you not surveying?
I would say that the top one would be domestic violence, because we don't want a situation in which somebody has contacted the police and then there's a message on their phone later that could be discovered by the perpetrator or the person in their life. We don't know what that situation is, and it's complex enough that we've stayed away from it. The second one is we avoid calls related to juveniles and minors where there are children involved and the child was the one making the call. And then third, we avoid most types of violent crime because there's so much trauma and there are investigations involved. And for people who don't know how this works, if you call 911, your call is recorded with a code. And that code will say something like, business theft or, something more serious like a stabbing. And so you have these long lists of dispatch codes, and that is what allows us to make sure that only people who are coded with certain types of calls are receiving a text message from us. And that text message says, this is my 90. We're an independent third party. Please click this link to share your optional feedback and a quick survey. And that's how we know that the surveys shouldn't be going to somebody who is involved in one of those three categories where we're currently not asking for feedback.
I was going to ask you what the text message said. So I'm glad that you went there and explained that, because I was curious what that delivery actually looks like. So we talked about what you don't do. You did say in the prep for this that you have started surveying sexual assault victims, correct?
Yes. So over time, we've started to survey a wider number of those calls that I've talked about. When we started, because feedback itself was a little bit of a new idea, and we wanted to make sure to introduce it slowly and get more proof over time that this was valuable, we started with a really narrow number of calls. These are things like noise complaints, animals. I mean, the least stressful things that you can imagine with a 911 center. And what that feedback showed us was that people were willing to share their experience and departments were willing to listen and act on it. And if you think about the history of law enforcement, this is actually a pretty big change and really has just happened more and more year over year for the last 10 years. We didn't start with something like sexual assault because obviously it's a really sensitive situation and a sensitive call for a department to be handling. Similar to violent crime, I was concerned that there was a risk of re-traumatizing people and asking something that wouldn't help the victim and wouldn't necessarily help the department. So those were the reasons that we didn't start with it. Now, as we've gotten more comfortable with how feedback matters and what we see in our survey results, we did start to offer this and even recommend it to departments who are using My90. The best practice is to include sexual assault victims in the list of call types that can receive this survey. And what we've seen is that, one, you don't have to ask people the exact same thing for all the different call types. You can have a survey that's shorter, that's more truncated and essentially a little bit more focused for a sexual assault victim than for a noise complaint caller. So that's one. You don't have to ask people the same things. And then two, What we've learned is that the most sensitive type of call leads to the most valuable feedback.
Sure.
And the one that I remember the most with our pilot partner was someone saying, I had to call in for sexual assault for my child, and the officers who showed up were well trained and they were kind and they were empathetic. And this was such a horrible situation, but I'm so grateful that these officers handled it this kindly. And this is a great example of one where we never would have thought to ask this when we started. And a parent calling on behalf of a child, and it's something really horrible. And we realized that that feedback meant more to the department than 100 noise complaint surveys. The department learned that those officers were doing a great job for one of the hardest types of calls and were well trained and prepared to handle it. So now we encourage more departments to, kind of push the envelope a little bit in terms of who they're willing to survey, because the information they get back makes a big difference.
Yeah. Well, I mean, isn't that another true lesson too, that like the best of everything is always in the hardest and scariest stuff. The most personal gain is in facing the thing that you're scared of the most. The best feedback you get is having the conversation you're most scared to have. That's always where the best returns come from.
And law enforcement is not an industry or a community where vulnerability is always an obvious value.
Sure.
And what I've learned is that some of the strongest leaders in that space that I've gotten to know are really the most vulnerable. And to your point, they really stand out because they're able to engage with people and be open in a way that's unique. And I think that what you're saying is completely true. And then when you see people model that and actually do it, it becomes easier for that to snowball and more people to be willing to do it, which says a lot about department culture and organizational culture and how to move in that direction, especially over time.
Yeah. Let's talk about those leaders for a second, because I would imagine that those leaders are also very strong personalities to get into those positions and pretty, I don't know the right word to say other than strong personalities, but confident in themselves as well. And so how do you see those leaders balancing that type of humility and vulnerability and the strong confidence that they need to be successful in those types of positions?
I think that the departments that have police chiefs or sheriffs that are really focused on the results are most able to create a culture in which that leader can succeed and convince others that that is one of the best ways to lead. If you're focused on results, I think we know that that approach actually moves the needle more. We've seen leaders who do that, who can get their team or their extended team. We're talking about departments that have hundreds or thousands of people. So to really motivate and engage and keep everyone on the same page for a shared mission and shared mentality is a really big challenge. And I think we've seen that leaders who are able to embrace that vulnerability a lot of the time can have the most loyal coworkers or colleagues or people who work under them. There's nothing like watching somebody who's really strong and, to your point, can be kind of a force of nature, be willing to be vulnerable to get that feeling of I would follow that person anywhere. And I think that when you see that effect, you realize that that's what being results oriented looks like in a way. You're willing to sacrifice some of your personal ego to think about what's best for the mission and the impact. I think communities really pick up on that as well. If you have a police chief that comes into your community, and let's say you're struggling with some big safety challenge, whether it's a rash of auto thefts or whether it's youth violence or whether it's guns on the streets, and you have a chief who's standing there in their most political voice, giving a talk about what they're going to do and what needs to happen and all of these things, versus a chief who comes in and spends time with that community and listens to what people want to tell him or her, I think we've seen what those two outcomes can look like. And there's so much more trust with the latter. So I've seen that in my experience, the leaders who are trying to drive the numbers down in terms of violent crime or property crime and that type of thing are the least conventional in a lot of ways, because they're so focused on the results that frees them up to just get the work done. And people love that.
Yeah. You hit on these things that I think are just so elemental and that so many of us struggle with, is like, we want to be successful in a way that highlights us or benefits us. We want the idea we want to have the direction. There's a lot of us, it's really easy to default to, we want success to be tied to how we look in the process. And if you get somebody who's really just focused on solving the problem, they're inherently going to be more open to ideas outside of ideas that they have.
And also, do they have the safety net where they're able to do that and focus on the results, and someone's going to back them up?
Yeah.
If it's a police chief, it's the mayor and city council. If it's us as individuals, it could be our manager or people that we work with. If it's the community, it could be your civic leaders, whether it's elected officials or less formally appointed leaders who are pillars of that community. And so I think that that's where it goes from this idea that one person is exceptional and they're getting it done, and we need to look to them to figure out what they're doing, and spreads out some of the responsibility more evenly. And it's, what is each of us doing to show up for other people so that they know if they're going to be vulnerable, we have their back. If someone on my team is going to be vulnerable, do they know that I'm going to be able to support them and listen, even if that's a little bit scary for them? And that's where it becomes my job to make sure that they're becoming those leaders long term.
Yeah. I think that's something any leader can keep in mind for their people, because even if they're not in a supported environment where they don't have that backing, they can be the backing for the people below them. So there's always, like, the environment above you is often out of your control, but the environment below you is totally within your control. And if you believe in these things and want this type of performance, you have the ability to set that for the people below you, regardless of what the environment above you is like. Now, obviously there's extreme exceptions to that, but for the most part, like, every leader has the ability to create that safety for the people below them.
Yeah. And I think that's where, if we're looking in hindsight, greatest hits, greatest misses, I think that for me personally, I'm an impatient person. I like to move fast. If we're not all moving pretty quickly in the same direction, I do get a little bit antsy. And I think that the learning curve there is, how do you still move fast and get results, but focus as much as possible on kindness and getting people to engage and move with you instead of pulling them in that direction. And that's an ongoing challenge. It's like, how do you move quickly and do so kindly? I think that's a tough one.
It is. That is one of the big leadership challenges, right, with people. So you touched on this earlier, but let's talk about the actionable part of this. How are police departments using this? And I guess, how are they using it internally? And then also, how are they using it externally? Like, are they broadcasting the results? Are they letting communities know that this type of feedback is happening? Are they going out and demonstrating changes that they're making in a public way? Like, how are they actioning this type of feedback?
One of our departments that we work with is not too far from you, in Aurora, Illinois. So Aurora has used My90 to ask people what they feel about the police department after their 911 calls. They do share the results publicly. They are one of the first departments in the whole country to share the results, and actually the very first to do so with a live dashboard instead of a PDF report that might have a time delay. They're really embracing the transparency side of it. And one reason for that is, if people want something from the police department, they want them to do something differently, or they're dissatisfied, this is actually a really good example of how they can show up and be part of the solution. It's kind of like, well, you can only be so upset if you're not speaking up and making your voice heard and trying to help us get there. So I like that it creates an opportunity for law enforcement community to partner as much as is possible. I will say we want to cast a wider net. Not everybody is going to be comfortable enough to go to a coffee with a cop event or something where they're having a face-to-face conversation. If there's real fear and history and really big problems there, that's actually why My90 exists, because we hope that those people are willing to talk to My90, even if they're not willing to talk to their department directly. That's why the feedback is impactful to the department, because they're capturing more people than would show up to the department hosted events. Now, Aurora is using it in a couple of interesting ways. One, it helps them decide where the community is asking for more police presence. I think departments are pretty aware these days about over-policing and being conscious of the fact that not all departments feel safer if their patrol cars go through the neighborhoods with the lights on. Some neighborhoods are asking for that. Some neighborhoods say, this is just another sign that you're out to get me. And I think that that's a good example of a department that will look at results and say, where does the community want to see more of us? How do they want to see us? Departments all around the country will get requests like, will you come visit this nonprofit organization or at this school or at this event and have your presence be there? They would so much rather go to the places where those invitations are being documented and tracked than do something with their limited resources that might not be as impactful. They have to use their judgment, because if you're just going based on these survey results, it's not nearly enough. If you're not capturing violent crime, for example, if you're not capturing another type of call that you want as part of your results, you can't say we're going all in on these survey results and going to neglect this part of the city. But it does give them a lot more information than when they started. And they've also used it to understand where they're short-staffed and actually work with city council to increase staffing levels to get back up to normal. So that's one example.
Yeah.
And I would say staffing across the country for law enforcement is down quite a lot. So departments are trying to figure out, with who we have, what do we do? And then another example in Florida, Hillsborough County, they've used the results to really look at individual issues that have come in and see how they can close the loop with the public. So one example was a mom who was concerned about somebody who was hanging around a bus stop where her kids were waiting for the school bus. And the department looked at this survey result come in and they said, we know that they're not expecting that we use this survey result to almost act as a help desk. We know that that's not the expectation here, but can we go above and beyond and check this out and see if we can solve a potential problem and build trust at the same time? So they went and actually checked out the bus stop. It turns out that the individual who had been kind of loitering there was a known sex offender, and they were able to issue a street report, which I think is kind of like a warning, and say, like, you can't hang out here. It's as simple as that. And it didn't result in an arrest. It didn't result in anything that was bigger than that. It was just, can we nip this in the bud and prevent a larger problem and make sure that everyone here understands what the expectations and the rules are? We could say that person may or may not have known that that was okay to be there, but regardless, they had a face-to-face conversation and documented, and they were actually able to let the mom know that they had done this. And as you can imagine, the mom was so astonished that not only did this one comment on a survey lead to a real outcome, she felt safer. Her kids felt safer. She was telling all her friends and family that the law enforcement office had gone out of their way and the sheriff's office had solved this problem. That's a force multiplier for building trust. One specific outcome is going to have ripple effects in her community, knowing that their voice matters. So the departments have used it to solve some specific problems, in addition to looking at more systemic issues like staffing, in addition to supporting their individual employees by saying, we have a grant program. Would you like a gym membership? Would you like a different type of load-bearing vest? Would you like a different type of equipment? And supporting the officers and the civilian staff members as well, using the internal survey results.
Interesting. Have you seen them use the survey to influence types of incidents that you're not surveying? Like, for instance, are they seeing results from sexual assault victims and maybe some other kind of theft, and they're able to say, oh, we can actually translate that to how we deal with homicides or some other type of violent crime?
That's a great question. I think that what the survey results are doing is normalizing the idea that you can have an interaction with a community member, even if you don't agree with them, even if that person is upset, even if you're having a bad day, and the way you treat that person matters. So I haven't heard departments coming to us and saying, our homicide detectives are now doing X, Y, or Z differently. But I have had a lot of people say to me, I'm surprised by the compliments that I'm getting at my department because we're just doing our job. And if I'm not saving the day with something, I'm surprised that common courtesy and just being polite and professional is so impactful to the community. It's kind of like the law enforcement expectations of what deserves a compliment is much higher than some of the compliments that they're getting. And I think that that is affecting how they're interacting with more people beyond just the calls where we're surveying.
Sure. Right. It's what's that? How to win friends and influence people. You just got to reinforce the behaviors that you want, and they start to spread.
That would be a great tagline for my 90.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. What other areas do you look out at, public, private sector, doesn't matter, where you think maybe not the exact method that you're using, but you think the lessons that you are building here would be impactful or most impactful? Where do you think we're not doing this type of communicative feedback work where it would have an outsized impact?
I'm always intrigued by these big, obvious problems that we all seem to accept that don't seem to get that much better over time. For law enforcement, everyone was just saying, we don't know what's going on. We don't have data to say whether or not this is part of a pattern or if this is a one-off situation. And my question was, why don't we have that information? Why is it so hard to understand the starting point here? And I think we have a lot of those problems that we're looking at. Some people are looking at them up close and some people are looking at them from afar. And for me, I think that saying you can do anything you want, but you can't do everything you want at the same time is very true. You know, if you're juggling work and family and all sorts of different things you're intrigued by, you have to pick one at a time. But when I look at what's happening with public safety more broadly, it's influenced by a lot of different issues, whether it is access to guns, whether it is education. And a lot of the times we'll see crime spike in the summer when there's no school. Mm-hmm. It can be influenced by weather, climate change, and looking at what makes the community safer or more endangered, and equity and access to the services that people need. So it's interesting because I feel like this approach, if I had infinite time, I would love to apply it to half a dozen big things that I try not to let me keep me up at night. But I do think that for the people who are working hard on those issues, the most effective, most impactful people I've seen in action are the ones where I've learned this approach. You know, go in listening first, go in and seek to learn and be curious, not tell people what you think. So in general, I feel like it's widely applicable. I wish we saw a little bit more of that approach sometimes with our loudest speakers, but yeah. I think that we have a lot that we could do there.
Love that. Final question. Well, second to last question. For those who might still be on the fence, most of the people who listen to this, I think, are corporate leaders or aspiring leaders. For those who are still a little bit scared to reach out and ask that difficult question, you know, hey, client, how are we doing? You know, God, I don't want to know if we're doing bad. It's too, you know, it's scary for somebody to tell you that you're not doing well. What advice do you have for them or encouragement do you have for them to lean into that?
I think it's just more efficient to have the conversation. Do you want to spend 5 more hours doing research on that client, trying to get intel, make a case with the other sources that you have, look at the news? Or do you want to have one direct conversation where you can get it in their own words with what they're willing to share? And I think that that's true for customers. I think it's true for team members. If something's not going well, can you have one direct, honest conversation that saves you both potentially weeks of stress and dancing around something that really you need to hear directly from somebody? I think that we only have so much time in the day. And so that frees us up to get to where we need to go faster and hopefully with a better outcome as well. Even if you don't like the outcome, it's better to know, in my opinion. So I think that that's a lot easier said than done. It's not like this is just easy for me every day. I would say I'm definitely working hard on how to have those conversations every single time something comes up. But in terms of where I place the values, I find that very motivating so that I can get better as opposed to ignoring it and having that be a weaker skill set. I'd like to see that be a stronger skill set over time as I practice.
I love that. And I interviewed a gentleman, Dr. Stephen Stein, on hardiness. He's a psychologist, wrote a book on hardiness. And one of the key components to building hardiness in life, which is not just the ability to get hit and bounce back, but the ability to get hit and fall forward and actually advance through adversity. And one of it is embracing challenge and reshaping your relationship with challenging obstacles in your life. And that is exactly what you just described, right? Like, I don't like it every day. It doesn't feel good all the time, but I know that I want to lean into that when it happens. And so then you can reinforce, okay, I know this is happening. I can lean into it. And that's how you can keep growing, keep getting the good feedback that helps you get better.
I completely agree.
Kona, this is awesome. I could pepper you with a lot more questions, but I won't, at least not on this episode. If there's any law enforcement listening, or if there are anyone out in the community who are connected to law enforcement in their communities and are like, wow, you know what? This is a really interesting idea. I'd love to share it. What's the best way to find you, share the information, sort of get the right people connected?
You can start by emailing my90@axon.com if you want to learn more about that specific solution. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to reach out. I've actually done that with some of your previous guests, which has been a lot of fun. And for the nonprofit I mentioned, that website is goalshaiti.org. But if you connect on LinkedIn, I can help point you in the right direction for any of the things that we've talked about.
Perfect. And we will put all of that in the show notes as well for anybody who is curious. Appreciate everybody listening. Kona, appreciate you coming on and appreciate the work that you're doing, because I have long thought, man, if we could just get communities and police to have a conversation together and to listen to one another, that type of conversation is how we solve any problem. And I have to think that building those types of bridges and those types of relationships are how we're going to solve the divide that we're seeing between communities and policing right now. And I just am very appreciative that there's somebody out there like you doing this work. So thank you for coming on and thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.